What we're going to do today is, like I said, take a couple of minutes to let them kind of tell their background and get started, and then we'll ask some questions, partially going off what was talked this morning and maybe throwing a couple issues in there, and then we'll also throw it out for y'all to ask some questions as we move forward. So I'll let you guys introduce yourselves. And
my name is Ray Laudriere. I work at a large law firm, Lock Lord. But I didn't know it was going to be a confessional, so I have to confess, like the others, that my grandfather was a lawyer, actually also a judge. My father was a lawyer.
You've got a great uncreative panel.
I have, well, this may not just be divine chance. There may be some reasons here as we get into this. I've been a lawyer for 33 years at the same firm, which has changed drastically over time, and I'm proud actually to admit that my daughter, one of our three children, is a new lawyer. So we're going 4 generations strong, and back beyond that we don't count because I'm sure they were criminals, and so we don't go back to what our ancestors did. But I think my dad did tell me something which I think is relevant, and I want to go back to the question that the counselor asked, which I thought was very good. And it follows up on what David and I were just talking about over the break, which is my dad said, you know, there's 3 professions, the 3 represented in this conference. And he said, what makes them unique are 2 things. And the first is each takes an oath. The Hippocratic oath, the oath to God, the oath lawyers take to defend the Constitution, the laws, and the system. And the other commonality is each, in their core essence, are counselors. And I think that's something that gets lost, and that's sort of one of my focus of looking at this in the mega institutions. So the firm I started with, I think I was number 40 at a firm called Rain Harrell back then. We've merged 4 times, most recently on January 1st with the Edwards Group, hence Lock Lords Edwards. We're now over 1,000 lawyers. One of my law school classmates sent me an email after the latest merger and said, darn it, can't you hold a job? Every time I get an announcement with you, I think this is your 5th law firm. And I wrote him back and said, yeah, but I haven't moved my office. But the growth there are reasons for the growth. Many of us know it. But one of the reasons is specialization. And one of the problems with specialization, as efficient as it is, just like the mega churches, is it loses the dynamic of what my father told me, which is the ability to truly know the patient, truly know the member of your church, parishioner in my faith, or so important to us to truly know the client in a way that we can advise them and give them advice. And when clients say to me, I want efficient services and I want the one lawyer out of 1,000 in your firm who has done this 100 times before, who can do it very quickly, efficiently, and cheaply, that's good, but that lawyer doesn't know the client and can't give them advice, and that's really what they come to us for. And it's hard. A lot of the clients don't ask for it, and when you see the moment, it's harder to do it if you don't have that relationship. Anything you want to say?
How y'all doing?
You said everything, huh?
I would just love I just want to be a part of this, so I'll let others.
I'd like to follow up on a couple of things that y'all said, so I'll do it in a couple, start in a different order. But I really want to focus on this idea of social justice because you brought it up in the talk that you had, and you just brought up social justice. I know you have a focus also. What does that really look like when you get these mega organizations, and what is their role and responsibility in that?
Well, since I brought it up, or since Jonathan brought it up, there's this. I think in the sense of professionalism, as Ray was saying, that we're counselors or we're advisors to people. Many times we follow the life of our patients or over a longitudinal period of time, and many times we get into relationships with the community, the sense of community, the sense of connectedness, the sense of what's happened in the economic downturn is an illustration. We were clearly affected by that professionally, right? My physician colleagues had patients who lost insurance and they needed to be provided care for at the time. But what's underneath there, and what I experienced even before 2008, right, was this just chronic persistent injustice that occurs in our region and the dullness to listening to the voice of those people and what we should do to restructure our community around that issue. And so counter to that activity is the economic engine of America that's pushing us toward consolidation for a lot of really powerful reasons that are set in motion by a free market. That which we celebrate most times because we consume the resources, the inexpensive bread and milk and whatever that we enjoy. We also have to, it comes with the backside, which it means it disproportionately affects people in an adverse way. I've called this notion of unnecessary suffering. And so there is some suffering that we see in healthcare that's clearly necessary. It's clearly part of the journey of being a person. But there's so much of it in our community that is not necessary that we can do something about. So it's kind of like that pathway or that reality is juxtaposed to our economic journey, which also is happening in parallel. So how do we recognize both, have the conversation about that as a community rather than devolving that responsibility to the government, whether at the federal, state, or local level, but rather have the conversation among the professions and then ask for government, ask for help from the community at large about how do we solve that rather than making it just a professional issue of that medicine needs to fix the healthcare problem for the uninsured or underserved, because it really is unjust. So I think that this type of conversation, we're doing this kind of work together, helps us get closer to that. So I'm going to hush up for that.
I'm not sure, and I think that Jonathan alluded to this. The megachurch phenomenon is not just about its size, right? It's about all of the cultural factors that Jonathan mentioned. And I would say similarly about a congregational commitment to social justice. There's nothing intrinsic in a large congregation that says it will or will not be committed to social justice, and there's nothing intrinsic in a small congregation that says it will or will not be committed to social justice. It has to do with the vision of that place, the vision of its founders, the vision of its current leadership, the energy of its community. It has a lot to do with leadership. I don't think it's necessarily you could track it by size. Similarly, by the way, there are small congregations that are very impersonal, right? Where you could be coldly greeted or not greeted at all. And there are large congregations that suffocate you with their love. So I don't think these are arithmetic matters. I think they're cultural matters, which to me was the substance of Jonathan's talk. So I don't know that there's a mega element to the commitment to social justice. I do think there's a mega responsibility. Again, what keeps me up at night, what I want to know when I retire, God willing, in a dozen years, is to be able to say, the question I want to ask myself is, did I harness the potential of, let's say our 2,500 families is 7,000 people. Did I harness the potential of 7,000 people for good? That's what I want to know. And there's all sorts of other things we do as preachers, right? We tend to people, we visit people in the hospital, we want to be present for people in times of need, all of which is sacred work. My keep me up question at night is, did we maximize the potential of these 7,000 people to create change for justice?
My keep me up question at night is, in a large organization where we've combined groups from various parts of the country, the world, with different histories, different cultures, and we have 1,000 lawyers, can we can we create and cultivate a firm culture that is appropriate to instill the values in the lawyers in our institution to do our profession the way it should be done? And we spend a lot of effort at that. It is a challenge. I think it starts with leadership at the top. And as we were talking, David and I'm a big believer in core value statements. Maybe I'm a 10 Commandments kind of guy, but maybe I worked a lot with JCPenney over my career, and their 7 principles or whatever. The first one is first do right by the customer. But I found organizations that tend to prophesize a little bit core values tend to send the message better of a common culture. Getting back to social justice in the legal community, a lot of that has to do with the lack of services, legal services for the poor, which is a growing problem. Mega law firms try to do it by requiring our young lawyers to do so many hours of pro bono service and doing a lot of community service. Financially, we try to contribute, but the real problem we're not addressing, and I agree with you, Jim, we have to do it communally, which is we're creating a culture in the legal phenomenon of unaffordable legal services. And for a lot of social injustice, legal services are a key element to assist. And how do we fix that problem? I'm leaving here to go hear a speaker once we're done here at noon at the UNT Law School. I think their mission is a very interesting one, in part to try to create a generation of lawyers committed to their communities and not to joining mega firms. At least that's the way I see that mission. And so I think we have to figure out a way to have access to justice for the disenfranchised, and that's a growing problem for a lot of reasons. And like Jim, I don't think we'll solve that problem just as lawyers, but as the community of the faithful together.
Actually looking up a book that I want to recommend.
We can have it up on that screen here.
That's why I'm looking it up like this. That's why I'm looking it up like this. It was recently just published by a colleague of mine, Robert Putnam at Harvard, entitled "Our Kids: The American Dream in Crisis." And really, my biggest problem, morally, right? There's ethical issues we have to tease out about mega firms, mega churches, and the like. But my biggest problem morally, as it relates to social justice with the topic under discussion today, is the consolidation of wealth, power, cultural capital, and access that we see going on. And I think that in terms of the cultural trends, some of the mega congregations, the mega law firms, and the like, are symptomatic of these larger prevailing trends. We know some of the statistics. We know that 10% of American population controls 2/3 of the wealth, right? We know that it was exacerbated between 1979 and 2007. We know that all gains since 2007 recovery have gone to the top upper class earners in American society. And any gains since 1980 for middle class and lower income people really can be attributed to dual working households, right? Many people joining the job market. And there's also this statistic that I like to throw out. In 1980, the average Fortune 500 CEO earned about 42 times as much as the average worker. By 2000, this same CEO averaged 500 times as much. I think this, when we're talking about social justice, when we're talking about being a mirror as faith communities, it's both a mirror, yes, because we reflect, but we also have to be communities that are willing to stand in judgment by revealing the dynamics and the prevailing trends of the dominant society to itself. And as long as we have this shift that is fracturing communities in the name of consolidation, because cultural capital, social capital is being denied. And this is happening across race and ethnicities now. Because, for example, African American elites are just as likely to segregate themselves, right? In communities, in schools, in neighborhoods. We see the privatization of communities now. In my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, right? I mean, there's so many communities that are now part of the move to annex. Right? They're cutting themselves off where they're privatizing police departments, fire departments, trash pickup, right? And pulling their tax base out in the process and leaving the larger communities to fend for themselves largely. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves, what's our commitment to the common good, right? And keep that on the table. And realize that in the name, once again, in the name of efficiency, right, all of our professions where we've taken oaths to serve, to protect, to be hands that meet needs of communities. At least where I stand, faith communities, we have to do something different because there's a whole lot of praying going on. But I grew up in the type of church that I was always taught that hands that serve are more important than lips that pray.
But kind of follow up, because a couple of you talked about this, is what are some of the ways then that large organizations affect these relationships with either parishioners or your patients or clients? And also tying into that, how do you meet their individual needs? Because you have a dual purpose now of the big, large corporation, but yet you have these oaths to take care of people.
I'll go first on that, and it's a question I asked to Jonathan during the break. I think that one of the things that I find, I'll say, sort of most frightening about the profile that you shared with us and the critique is the valorization and idolization of the preacher, sort of the preacher becoming the brand for the congregation. And I think that a mistake that we may have always made, if we made it, was to think that that an individual professional could ever be the source of the weaving of human community. And so it becomes all the more nefarious in the syndrome that you described. So the way we do it is not by one or two or three or a team of however many clergy being the source of human love in that place. It has to come from the people to each other. And I think that the more that we put one face, one profile, right? It's exactly what Jonathan said. It's a totally false intimacy. And the real way to do it, that requires the humility that Jonathan also hinted at, the real way to do it that requires the humility that Jonathan hinted at is to recognize it's not all going to happen through you, right? It's going to happen through all sorts of people being present for each other. Now, the leader has to create the culture in which those people are willing to be vulnerable. You have to create the countercultural culture, right? Where people are willing to be vulnerable, where people are willing to be present for each other, where people are willing to tell their stories. But that's where it's going to come from. My biblical instance here is that in Exodus 18, Moses' father-in-law sees Moses wearing himself out. And he says, you're not going to be able to do this by yourself. You're going to need magistrates, you're going to need judges, you're going to need leaders, you're going to need lower courts. You can be the court of appeals, but you're not going to be able to make decisions for everybody all day long, right? And that's the same Moses whose burial place is not disclosed in Scripture, probably because there was a worry about turning it into a shrine. The same Moses whose name does not appear in the Haggadah, our order of service for the Passover Seder, because the people, the sages who created that Haggadah didn't want it to be Moses' story. And I think that we have to, if we're going to make this work, if we're going to reweave human community in an age of fractionalization, it's going to happen person to person and not flowing down vertically.
I was just going to add one thing. I'm sitting here wondering why I'm on this panel, and I'm not sure why, but this is such a great group of people. I did get a sort of message telling me why I'm on this panel. As I walked in this morning, got a message from my oldest daughter. It's number two, who's the lawyer. Our oldest daughter lives in Chicago. She's 30 years old, and sent me a text as I'm walking in, and the only texts I get are from my kids. So I have the only time my phone beeps is when I get a text. On occasion from my wife, but usually it's responding to one of the texts from my kids. But anyway, my oldest daughter, Mary, sent me a text saying, Dad, I just got a text, I'm sure, from my classmate at Ursuline High School, Jenny Beasley, who says she's attending a conference you're a speaker at. And then I realized if there's a conference of people who are comrades of my daughters, I'm now viewed old enough to be on the panel of the conference. That may be the only reason I'm here, but I did want to comment on their thing, which I think everybody here, we are all leaders in our community. That's what's so great about this cross-professional conference. We are leaders, and I want to go back something that the good doctor here said, and that is we can't stand back and do nothing. And I think as leaders, we have to tell our community, people who really do look up to us. In my business, it's mentorship. I think that's a powerful tool. I think in any part of life, people look at other people and follow, whether it's at the mega church or in the community or in the sports arena, whatever. You look up to. We are leaders, and we can make more of an impact than we think if we'll stand out there in our leadership and address issues that we think need to be addressed. And not be afraid to speak up or speak out, not be afraid to lose our church, lose our standing in the community, not be afraid to be a little bit shunned if we speak out on things we believe are important. And then communally, we can do it. And the only other thing I would say is, and we've got to work, interpersonal is one-on-one, and it's not just the mega churches, it's our entire culture of not really spending the time to work interpersonally one-on-one with the people we should be intimate with. Not just our family and friends and comrades, but a lot of people.
Yeah, I think I would kind of just add on to these comments, which is we as Americans and Western society has developed somewhat of a love affair with brands. And I like CVS and you like Walgreens, and I like Baylor, you like Methodist, and Mayo Clinic connected with Methodist, and so now we've really got a winning combination, right? And I think, as David was saying, that the actual meat of that is the relationship that is created between two individuals under that brand. And we all have favorite places we like to go to, restaurants or go shopping, whether that's a corner store or that's at Nordstrom or whatever. And it's really, the reason why we like that is because we've made a human connection. So it's really our humanity that gives us this common micro experience that we're sharing with one another. So, and I totally agree, Ray, is that we stand against that. We stand opposed to anything that kind of drives us away from that. So in the practice of medicine, I think that I've been going through a little bit of family healthcare issues with my elderly father recently, and it was so powerful to be able to have a relationship with my dad's primary care doctor to get the key information at the key moment, right? And I had a phone call with my mom on the way over here today, and I need to make another phone call, right? Because there was something that happened last night. Everybody in this room is going like this. Absolutely. There is no brand called Baylor that's going to solve that problem for you. But there is somebody's name who may work at Baylor that says, yeah, that's a human that I can actually touch. Now, we have doctors in private practice around the region who aspire to have their identity, their brand identity, be your connection, to be that which we all need and want as we enter into those vulnerable moments, whether they're with our children or with our parents or ourselves. And it's out of that moment of humanity that we're able to say, I feel connected, I feel like this is meaningful. Now, what's standing opposed to that is this efficiency issue, which is, by the way, we do know this efficiency equation in medicine now. It's, I'm going to do it now, quality divided by cost equals value. Okay, now you experience value. So I am now going to objectify the value equation that you've received from us by using specific metrics. But what you don't see in that equation is, how did you perceive that value? How did you experience the relationship with the person who greeted you? Or, did it feel like you were at the Department of Motor Vehicles? When you were calling, so it's a really interesting issue. So I think we are responsible for creating a counter movement as individuals who have human identity given to us by God that stands opposed to this corporate conglomerate that has no personhood. And that's the beautiful part of it, is that we actually are humans standing against corporate entities, and so we're immensely powerful. But that means that we have to be kind of aware and talk about the fact that it is happening, but it shouldn't cause us despair or hopelessness. It actually should make us reach down into our faith and say, okay, how does my faith teach me to respond to this? And I think that that's really, so it's kind of like a backhanded opportunity for us at this moment, I think.
That prompts one other thought for me. I think we also have to be, I think one of the other risks of these large organizations is we start to equate community with homogeneity. We say the community is the place where everybody's like me, when that's exactly what community shouldn't be, in my view. Community should be the place where I feel enough common bond that it's the place where I tolerate diversity, right? Where I'm not threatened because I know of what we share, right? And so actually, to me, a church or synagogue community should be maybe one of the only places where I sit down next to somebody who's unlike me, because the rest of my life is so segmented and niched and homogeneous. So I think that that point about the sacred value of the individual, I think if our religious communities and our professional communities are doing things the right way, then we can recognize the sacred value of the other, of the one who is different from me and not just the one who is like me.
So how do you create a culture in your organizations that get to that you're talking about, and having that continuity throughout them, especially because you have some organizations that started off small and then you're hiring and you're growing, and as those change, you used to have one decision maker, and then all of a sudden you have midline managers or different clergy doing those types of things. And then the second way is you're talking about mergers. So you start off with an organization culture that you have, but you're bringing in another firm or another agency. And so how do you get a broad culture and get them along with those lines to create these environments that you're talking about?
One method that we've instituted is our customers and my business are physicians. The premise is if we take good care of physicians, physicians will then be enabled to take good care of their patients, because that's on the front line what they're really doing every day. So the response would be making a phone call to the physician's practice and saying, how'd we do today? How'd we do with that last interaction? Because you are the individual. Again, it gets back to this notion that you are the individual, and to some extent, your health status as a physician is vitally important in order for you to deliver that care to the patient. So that'd be one method. So when you think about well-being of a community, you have to think, well, what's the professional well-being? How's the leadership doing, or how are the physicians who deliver the service, how are they doing? What is their well-being? And so that's one of the ways to do it.
And there's research that actually supports that if you do internal service to your people there, that actually translates out to the customers.
I guess I'll answer your question directly. So in our latest merger, our chair, our leader, a woman named Jerry Clements, who fortunately I've been friends with because she started the same little small spot I did in Dallas as a lawyer, same year. We're pledge sisters. And but our leader, Jerry, when we did this latest merger, so our firm was based in Texas, but also combined with a Midwest Chicago-based firm, and we had offices around the country, but not much on the East Coast. And we were looking to expand the footprint, that's the legal term, on the East Coast. And we found an East Coast firm that seemed like the right footprint, the right specializations that would fit with ours, all the things that corporates, mergers look at. And I say it starts with leadership. She did, and when she sat down, and I ought to say the challenge. The challenge was, we said, we're not going to do this unless it's a cultural fit and common values. And of course, a lot of our people said, wait a minute, they're based in New York and Boston. How can that happen? With all due respect. He's an Atlanta boy or Georgia boy, so he understands. But what she did was, in the first meeting, she sat down and said, okay, we have to do a statement of common values. That's the first thing we're going to do. Before we start talking about anything else, she got the boards together, the executive committees together, and said, let's talk about common values. And let's talk about what's important to us and what are our goals and what are we trying to do. And they wrote up a statement on common values, which was attached to the ultimate merger agreement, and it was the best thing about it because it said things that we're going to agree to. And, there are people in New York and Boston who share a lot of these same values. And in our view, in our profession, a lot of what we took the oath to do, to give the service. As a lawyer, our clients, we owe them a fiduciary duty. That's the legal term. technical definition of that is we must put our clients' interests first above ours. And that's a hard thing to do when you're in a business, you're trying to make money. But if that's your first principle and you really look at that, I was in a very difficult meeting the last couple of days where we had a very difficult problem, but I was very glad our leaders said, well, we have to do what's right for our clients. Unfortunately, in this case, it was a issue that affected two clients, and whatever we decided, one was going to be disadvantaged, the other advantaged. But we said, we have to look solely at that. So I think in leadership and in focusing and in standing back, she sort of pushed everybody to say, let's first make sure we can have these agreed upon common goals and cultures and set that out as the standard, and then we'll talk about the other issues. So just by prioritization, she sent a message to the group about this is what we're going to be as a combined group.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, you want to go? Go ahead, please.
Well, to respond directly to the question, I think that one of the things that we have to do is, and this is, I've been chaired with, I'm chairing a task force at Harvard University right now that is on diversity and inclusion on the campus, right? Which is, and in many ways, we're trying to respond to the growing fragmentation of American society and rethink how we do both admissions, but shifting the conversation from admissions to what is our mission at Harvard College as being a liberal arts education. And so we're trying to shift the conversation so that we are not simply rewarding a testocracy culture, right? Because right now, in so many institutions, SMU is, I'm sure, is no different, right? We are moving into these quote unquote standards of meritocracy, right? And testing, for the most part, I mean, the evidence is out, right? What does it represent? It represents it traces better than anything else your socioeconomic background and how well you'll do your first year in college, right? So rather than looking at the mission of institutions like ours as finishing schools and or the institutions that are simply going to select out the refined in order to put our brand on them, we have to think about what's the value, right, of creating communities, diverse communities with people who represent a wide range of life experiences so that we can try to work against the disrupting of the consolidation of power that we were talking about. Also, again, the evidence is in. It's inefficient, right? Consolidation of power, homogeneous, monolithic cultures are inefficient. They work against the best practices of organizations. Test was released, I'll give you two examples. A test was released by Harvard Business School, right? Where they selected people who scored high on tests, right? And they made them work together in groups to solve particular goals and dilemmas. The groups with more women, regardless of how high the test scores were, the groups with the most women were actually the most effective and efficient in solving these problems, right? Right? Like my sister said, we know that already, right? We didn't, right? Also,
Sadly, we do too.
Also, I mean, in terms of business brands, right? Whether it's whoever came up with the great idea to name a car Nova, Chevy Nova, not realizing that in so many languages that Nova means what? It can't go.
No go.
It don't go, right?
No go.
Or just a couple of weeks ago, somebody came up with the great idea at the company that I love, Krispy Kreme, right? Somebody came up with the great idea to start a Krispy Kreme club, like, clubs where you get your things punched and the like, right? And so they started a Krispy Kreme club on Tuesdays, and they decided to be playful, and Krispy Kreme club, all starting with K's. And so therefore, an advertisement rolled out, KKK Tuesdays. Clearly there were some people in the room, or there needed to be some more people in the room, put it that way. So once again, how do we speak to this at a kind of structural level and at an institutional level? We have to demonstrate how this kind of consolidation of power and resources that are creating homogeneous monolithic communities are working against all of our best interests. It's ineffective and it's inefficient.
So my direct answer is that it's a dance, it's a challenge, right? For exactly this reason. On the one hand, we want core ethos and core values that guide us. On the other hand, as a large institution, there are a lot of disadvantages. I tell my congregants all the time, there are a lot of disadvantages to being part of a large congregation, right? But one of the advantages should be, for example, a diversity of religious leadership. So I think about big arrow and small arrow, like the big arrow where its sides are like this and it's pointing this way, has room within it for a lot of small arrows that aren't all marching in lockstep. So long as the big arrow is heading in the right direction in terms of core values, a member of Temple Emmanuel should be able to say, Stern's not my cup of tea, I'd rather talk to Rabbi X. Right? Because if they have to put up with all the other crap of being part of a large congregation, they should at least get a choice, right? So it is, yes, about enforcing core value and core direction and vision, but at the same time valuing diversity of experience and diversity of leadership even within that large organization. So I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's easy at all. When I first became senior rabbi, and I at a relatively young age, and I was making my first, and I think a lot of it has to do with, by the way, the people you bring in, right? And how you communicate with those people and how you reinforce the values of those people. It's why, the receptionist is the most important person in the institution, because the receptionist delivers the first message to everybody. But when I was first making my first hire of another rabbi after I had become senior rabbi, I was talking to a mentor of mine, and I said, do you think I should make sure to hire somebody who's 20 years older than I am? Should I look for age diversity in creating this staff? And my mentor said to me, well, yeah, age diversity might be important. And he said, but I think theological diversity might be even more important. And that was and again, it can't be heading in the wrong direction in terms of the big arrow, but that was illustrative to me of saying, okay, we want core commitments, but we also want to create the kind of surface area that recognizes the diversity of our population.
Which makes it even harder to manage and challenge at the same time. So we're talking about conflicts. Do you think that there are these large organizations pose conflicts that are conflicts or interests or conflicts of what you're supposed to do to your clients, so the duties that you perform, are they different than in these larger mega-sized organizations, or are they pretty similar to the small organizations? So for instance, as the law as it goes forward, you may have multiple clients in that organization, so they may be on opposing sides and you have to represent both of them. So how do you deal with some of those types of conflicts with these mega-sized organizations and do it in an ethical way? Because there's obviously some moral and ethical issues that go along with that.
I'll start, because in large law firms, that's probably the single most biggest professional problem, because the more client, if you only represent one client, you're not going to have a conflict with any other client. The more you represent, pretty much exponentially, the more conflicts you have. And large law firms have a lot of systematic ways to identify those. The nightmare is you wake up and find out, we're representing a client in Atlanta, my good partner, Julie, and Stan, my partner in LA, is suing that client. And we hadn't figured that out. So we have a lot of systems, computers, backups to try to identify that. But they get much broader in terms of the client's interests are so varied that we may be taking a position in Atlanta on a matter for a client who wants us to advocate that position, and we're taking a contrary position, or one the client thinks is contrary. And actually the biggest problem is identifying them when you get large, and then once you identify them, to talk to the respective clients and to try to do the right thing, putting the client's interest first. But it is a problem, but it's one that if you can identify them, you can work hard together to solve them. The more difficult problems really, I think, are when the client's interests might be in some way adverse to the law firms. And whenever you're charging a fee for any services, immediately your customer, your client, your patient's interest is in some way diverse from yours. Well, it's in their interest to charge them nothing or very little. It's in your interest to charge them what we like to call a fair fee, what most people think is an excessive fee. And so, but there are other ways that it gets more nuances, and I think there is no solution to them. I think the only guiding principle is they are, like you were saying in response to the question about the 10 Commandments, you've got to have context and you've got to look at the individual situation, and you have to find out as much as you can to make the best judgment you can.
I think this starts to strike at some of the real very, very challenging conundrums that we're running into in medicine. And I'm aware there's a lot of attorneys in the room, so my business law class taught me that for-profit, publicly traded companies have a fiduciary duty to the stockholders. So that puts the corporate entity at the top of the mind about what we need to be paying attention to with regards to value and profitability. CVS, just think for just a second. CVS, Walmart, as their clinics, as you go into the clinics, kind of what that value proposition might be for the worker who's been tasked to care for a patient or a physician who's employed under that rubric. So I see, and my experience has been in working in the Dallas healthcare community, is that there is, as you move away from the publicly traded entities down into the not-for-profit large conglomerates, that still starts to be present, and that is the company, the large entity that employs thousands of people in the metropolitan area, has a responsibility to look after the bottom line of that corporate entity while they're taking care of patients. So it really creates an ethical conundrum or conflict immediately. Okay, now on the extreme, you have the individual practitioner who has the same responsibility of taking care of the 4 employees and the healthcare benefits and the salary growth for those 4 employees with a falling reimbursement rate from the Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and from the payer community. So how do we do that? How do you actually take care of your employees' benefit structure and salaries when your income is, your actually reimbursement's going down? So across that entire continuum, whether you're a micro enterprise of one solo physician all the way to a publicly traded entity, we have that same intellectual work we have to do. Now, but at the end of the day, we're still taking care of a person, right, who's ill and vulnerable and needs help, and at times can't afford either just the visit or the prescription that I wrote or the 3 prescriptions that I gave them, and they go to the pharmacy and go, I'll have to take 1, not 3. So that challenge is and conundrum is where I see the work we have to do as we move toward this larger conglomerations. It becomes a harder and harder value prop to satisfy or to solve. And I just, the only way I know, the only way I can advise again about that is just say we just need to be aware of it and realize that not one size fits all, that we need to have the diversity that David's talking about so that we can all fit into that. But be cognizant of the fact that these are still human beings that have unique features given by our Creator, no matter what faith we're in. And so I think that cuts across that. And I think that's kind of what I hear us saying. And that's kind of the work that I think we have to do as professionals is to understand that again, I'll go back to this, corporate entity is not a person. And so we need, when it comes to that tension, then we need to vote for the person, however that looks. And that's a real difficult thing given our laws and our fiduciary responsibility. And so I'll kind of throw that out there as a little provocateur.
Part of where the corruption comes into is how we're measuring success, right? Because when you're looking at growth of just numbers of people in a practice or in your church, and then we reward those types of behaviors. And sometimes there's even a short-term focus rather than looking at the long-term focus because you're trying to meet those measurements. How do you think that plays into the ethics that's coming into the organizations and also maybe corruption within those organizations?
I'll touch on that. One of the, in my view, worst developments in the educational field is rankings of schools. And having been involved both with my college a little bit, I went to a small college in the middle of a cornfield in Indiana. It was the only place that would let me try to play college football, so I went there, 800 students. But even in the smaller schools and in law schools, certainly, the rankings become the driving force behind so many decisions. It becomes sort of those 10 commandments, and that's very unfortunate. Similarly, in big law, one of the worst developments starting about 20 years ago was the trade journals that would list firms and rank them. And I know you're going to be shocked, but they rank them in terms of size and profits per partner. Again, that sort of thing. And it's really easy to say, well, just ignore that stuff. But then the law students who are at the schools read that and say, well, if this firm is this size, it must be better. It's number whatever in the rankings, okay? If they have so many profits, it's ranked in the profits. And then when you try to hire lawyers to combine, or if you're merging with someone, that people look at that stuff. Numbers are so easy that they become a substitute for any intellectual analysis so often. Just take a ranking, okay? How did the Cowboys do in defense this year? They were the number 13th ranked defense, so that tells you how they play. Like, well, I thought it was about winning or losing, not, where you're ranked in it. And I think those create pressures and things which are a big issue in a lot of organizations. And certainly in corporate America, you're going to look at profits. You do have the duty to your shareholders. You do have the duty to the other stakeholders to employ people. But I think when we start looking at numbers and rankings and other fictional ways to measure the mission, we're so far off base, not just in churches, but in all of our institutions.
And to maybe throw in before someone else is when you get larger, you also have more stakeholders that you are responsible to. So it's not just shareholders, but you have clients, you have the community, you have a bunch of different things. And a lot of times they're wanting very different things. So it creates some conflict even within there. So that causes some issues within there also.
It probably doesn't come as a surprise given Jonathan's presentation, but religious communities take a lot of their cues from the business community, right? So why do our congregations have boards of trustees and executive committees? I promise you, it's not in any, those phrases do not appear in any scripture, okay? So why do we have boards of trustees and executive committees? Because the businesses had boards of trustees and executive committees. If that's how you run an organization, that must be how you run an organization, right? Congregational leadership hierarchies started to flatten in imitation of business hierarchies starting to flatten. So now we get metrics. I hate metrics, which isn't necessarily a responsible thing for a leader to say. I wouldn't say I hate your question, right? The question we have to keep asking ourselves is, how are we going to measure the success of what we're doing? But metrics and tilting that towards statistical analysis gets me worried, right? So the core Jewish teaching here is teaching the Talmud from 1,500 years ago. Person who saves a single life, it is as if they have saved an entire world. Person who destroys a single life, it is as if they've destroyed an entire world. So that's an anti-metric statement, right? So that's an anti-arithmetic statement, right? It says that there is eternal in the one. So that's challenging if you're trying to measure stuff, right? Then you're saying how many people showed up for this, and if the pastor or the rabbi spent this much time on this one person and then they didn't get to these three others, then these three others are upset because the pastor or the rabbi is inaccessible, right? So again, no easy answers, but it's the right question. How do we measure the success of what we're doing? I run the other way from metrics.
But I want to play the flip side too. It's like the conference. Everybody who put all the work into this conference, and I think the speakers are excited to see such a great, large number of people attend. I don't think anybody would call it successful if 2 people showed up, in addition to the great keynote speaker and the 3 panelists. And in a mega church, if you're the pastor of the church and you are saving one-on-one, but you have a congregation of 1, are you really, is that success? When really your mission is to serve more than that. So there is a flip side of it, but I agree with you. What's that old saying? Statistics there's two kinds of statistics, lies and damn lies. But yet it's so easy to measure in numbers that we put way too much weight in those kind of things when we're measuring success. And if we can lead and fight against that a little bit to say, well, how are we doing on our core mission, as opposed to some measured quantification that's easy to understand but maybe doesn't reflect what we're really trying to do.
I agree, because I really agree with both points. And I think it's the difference between information and insight, right? Insight into the information. That's really what you were saying about the scores, right? I mean, it's intellectually lazy in so many ways, right? When we rely on metrics and we do not take into consideration the context, the possible application, and the possible fruit that might be born out of human activity and interaction. And so an example would be, I can give examples from higher education. Right now, you use the example if 2 people came to this lecture today. Well, we've been struggling with that in higher ed, right? In terms of, think about all these endowed lectures, right, that you have on a college campus like SMU and at Harvard. Attendance has really been dropping in recent years, right? It's just not the intellectual format, right? That is the choice of a growing generation. In particular, when there are so many other ways to access the intellectual insights of particular thinkers. Where once people would pack into an auditorium because they had to hear the latest words of Paul Tillich, right? Well, they can now go to YouTube and go to many other places. And so it's not the metric. However, we have not stopped having these lectures, but we have reformatted and repurposed them. And so we had a lecture the other night where we changed it to a conversation between the president and the guest lecturer, where the president interviewed the guest lecturer, right? We maybe had about 40 people show up, right? Which in a space that seats 800 would seem disappointing, right? Within a week, thousands have already viewed it on the Harvard webpage, and on iTunes U, right? On iTunes University, right? And so it's doing work that so expands. And so once again, if we would just go off the metric, right, or the information, so it's how do we get particular insight into the information, whether we're talking about service provision, whether we're talking about the formats of what we do, whether we're talking about how we interact with one another. And that's the step that, unfortunately, too many in the name of efficiency aren't willing to think critically about.
I'm going to tell a story that we all probably can identify with this. There was a day when I'm looking at all of y'all. Y'all look kind of my age, so it's going to be most of it'll work. Y'all all remember going to the doctor when the doctor wasn't staring at a computer screen, don't you? Yeah. Now you go to the doctor, and the doctor may spend quite a bit of time not paying attention to you, looking at you in the eye. So this notion of data and measures and kind of underscoring that has really transformed the whole physician journey of having to put information into an electronic medical record to get discrete data out. By the way, I learned this word called discrete, and now I know what that means. You can actually pull the data out of the computer, which then is able to maybe compete with the billboards, plural, that you passed on the way to this meeting, that says I am, or we are, Methodist or Baylor or THR or UT Southwestern or whatever brand you happen to be drawn to based on color or shape or what have you. But what stands behind those messages is hopefully some data. The data that says, hey, if you go online, you can see we're going to be transparent with our quality, our error rate, and we're going to cut that data based on race, demography, and insurance status. That doesn't happen today. It doesn't exist. But the pressure to actually compete with the Joneses is driving cost and frustration, and then the experience. So think about your experience now of what happens when you see the physician or when you're having that. You want to have a conversation, but it's really about putting the data in the EMR. So one of the comments I wanted to make about this was that this whole consolidation process is driving cost so rapidly in healthcare. If you just looked at marketing, and if you looked at what it took to support what you're actually putting on the billboard or putting on the TV, to to capture your attention and maintain you as a connected to my brand. So as physicians in private practice, in the private enterprise, as a solo practitioner or a small group thinks about that competitive issue, there's a pressure to consolidate. There's a pressure to get bigger, to align with an entity that can help you do that. And then the larger value proposition that we're going to experience going forward starts to get more and more stressful. And so how do we deliver value back to you as an individual physician or individual practitioner when we're simultaneously trying to keep up with the Joneses on measuring and showing data that in many ways is difficult to capture. So I'm just going to put that out there, and I think most of you know that, but I think it's typified by watching your doctor pay attention to that screen. There may be something going on there.
I'm glad I'm not the only. I've wondered what they were typing. Has anybody done this? I've intentionally given one word or very short answers and then sat there and watched them type another chapter, like they're writing a book or something. And I figured, like, what the hell are they typing?
All right, on that note, we're going to open it up for questions out in the audience. So
We'll do the same thing again, try to take turns in the professions. Dr. Sadler.
Oh, thank you, panel. I was intrigued by one facet, among others, of course, Professor Walton's talk that has not yet been directly addressed by everyone, and that is the idea the megachurch congregant is anonymous. And we see this in medicine, complaints by patients all the time that doctors don't listen to me. I get shuttled from one specialty clinic to the next, and I'm sort of a nobody. Nobody really understands me as a whole person, et cetera, et cetera. There may be related complaints in law. And I'd also like for you all to explore that idea of anonymity, but also think about how you've addressed it so that, going back to the motif of the importance of the individual, how you can recognize the individual within this, mega rubric.
Well, I can give you a congregational example. One of the ways in which our congregation, I would not classify, either before or after Jonathan's presentation, I would not classify our congregation as a megachurch, in part because he began his description of megachurches by saying they're efficient. We don't have a tagline, but if we did, it would be, if you don't like organized religion, you'll love us. But one of the things that we are part of a small cohort of about 5 large Reformed Jewish congregations in the country that are actively and deliberately emulating one specific feature of megachurches, and that is the prominence of what megachurches call small groups. And this goes back to what I was saying before about the lateral human-to-human connection. I do not know the first, middle, and last names of not every member of my congregation, but who knows what percentage that would be. What I do want is my congregation to be a place where people feel like they are known. And the way that a lot of large congregations are getting at that now is by forming groups of 8 to 12 people that meet on a regular basis that become fundamentally involved in each other's lives. We're just beginning this initiative at Temple Emmanuel, not accidentally doing it at the same time as we're doing a physical expansion. Because we said this will be the integrity test of the physical expansion. That we are going to start creating relationship at the same time as we're trying to create an architecture of relationship. And if we don't do it, then the architecture is a lie. And so I think that the way to try to get at this is by creating the structures that help people come into regular, ongoing, meaningful contact with each other. I'll give you one short example of how it could change what a place does. So we, like in our congregation, it's called the Caring Congregation Committee, right? It's a group of volunteers who go visit people in the hospital. Well, if our small group experiment works, we're not going to need a Caring Congregation Committee, because the Caring Congregation Committee is whoever is the small group of the person who's in the hospital. And they're not doing it because they're on a committee, right? They're doing it because they're in direct, ongoing relationship with that person. So it's an experiment. We'll see if it works, but that's one way we're trying to get at this anonymity question.
In in the work we're doing, I think we're exploring this notion of team-based healthcare, where a physician starts to lead a team, and a patient or a patient's caregiver enjoys a relationship with a care navigator or a care coordinator that then is a representative, so that we can kind of break down that problem. Everybody probably would enjoy it if they had a medical home where they had a primary care physician that they felt connected to by brand. And I think we can measure that. I think we could actually say, can you name your primary care doctor, number one, but number two, do you feel connected to him or her? If you have one, but you don't feel connected, then we've failed, right? And I think that kind of underscores what David's talking about. And so I think that's where, because of the conglomerate trend, we have to do something to counter that. And this is one approach and a short answer to your question.
Ray, can you take a minute and talk about the tension between specialization in legal services and whole client, the sort of thing you alluded to earlier? I think that responds to John's question as well.
Specialization, and I misheard the last thing.
In legal services, so that we send you off to our ERISA partner, but there's a partner in charge of the client relationship to maintain the whole person kind of relationship.
Certainly, I'll try, and to me, it gets back to the counseling aspect again. But I've got to start with specialization. Somebody once told me that this is true in medicine. I know it's certainly true in law, a lot of other fields, that we get more and more specialized. So every day we learn more and more about a narrower and narrower field until one day we're going to know everything about nothing. And I feel that way sometimes in specialization. But what the problem with specialization gets back to counseling, and that is in the law business, when clients call us, as I said before, they want to find somebody who is very knowledgeable about a real specific area. And in the business clients, a lot of times that's government, tax, whatever, and we may have someone, this is sort of the accounting firm model, we may have someone who's an expert on Ugandan tariffs or whatever it might be. And we find him and they can get the answer to the client. But since they don't really know the client, they don't really know the client's business, they don't really know the client's goals, you can't effectuate the most important thing, which is the counseling. It's, if legal services, fortunately, are not question and answer where you send it to the computer and the computer tells you the answer, usually a number, as to what the right answer is. It's counseling about what should we do in this situation, usually which is more complex than a very simple answer. And to be a counselor in any of our professions, you have to know, in mind, your client. And I like to say, kiddingly among my partners, that nowadays my client, of course, I'm a trial lawyer, and so I deal with clients in difficult situations, maybe not that much unlike medicine, but my clients really don't want to see me. They don't want to talk to me. They really don't want to hear from me. All they want is an email saying, problem solved. But in order to do that, and in order to give them the advice of which way should you go to try to help them find the path to solve the problem, you have to understand who they are in the business. And that's what's missing, and that's what we have to fight against in terms of letting our clients know that.
We had a question up here, I think.
I'm Sam Martin. I'm an assistant professor of communication at SMU, so I don't really fit in any of the three categories. Sorry. Oh, yeah. But my question is, we've been talking a lot about social justice, which, and I study public discourse about inequality, and to me that sort of elides a little bit in using this term social justice. It kind of elides how a lot of people, in and of itself, that is a problematic term because a lot of people don't like it. And it drives toward the political question of the deserving and the undeserving poor, right? And if you look at particularly what's been happening by state legislatures in the middle part of the country, even just this week, and what's been happening in terms of saying what people can do with their welfare benefits and what they cannot do, like use it for psychics and to go to the community pool and this kind of thing. So this goes to how churches go about doing outreach. And this seems to be a room full of people committed to social justice, like that's a good, unproblematic thing. But that's not true to everyone, right? And so I just wonder if you all could comment about that as an obstacle, because it is an obstacle. So it's a big obstacle, I think, and so I just want to throw that out. And that leads me to my second question, which goes to your remarks earlier. But if you look at the research in sort of the 70s leading to the rise of Reagan in the 80s, there was a real turn in public policy and welfare programs and that kind of a thing to making them more efficient. And we have also talked about efficiency as a kind of automatic good. Like, it's efficient. But why should efficiency be automatically good, right? Why is that a foremost value? Because maybe that's not how we should run our programs aimed at social justice. Maybe that's not how we should do our public policy programs. Or maybe it is, but why is that automatically the value?
Yeah, those are great questions, Professor Martin. The first, I mean, I think you nailed it in terms of the social justice being an overdetermined, if not loaded term now in the American lexicon. And it's one of the reasons that even during my talk, you heard me say, not just tongue-in-cheek, the good of the other, what Aristotle might refer to as justice, or you've heard me use language of common good quite often, because increasingly I have found myself articulating out what I mean by social justice, right? Because it becomes a heuristic shorthand, and I speak to a diverse enough crowd, and to a conservative enough crowd at Harvard, where I notice when eyes roll, right? Where individual responsibility, personal responsibility, language of efficiency, deserving and undeserving, it has what Linda Kentz, another communication theorist, would call cultural resonance, right? It's just true because it always is, right? And it is because it's true, right? And so in appealing to how people should act, how people should behave, how people should pull themselves up by their bootstraps. These are all things that just register, right, kind of in the American psyche. And you find yourself pushing a boulder up a hill when you're trying to articulate the language of social justice. However, in the roots of American democracy, right, at its best, in the roots of our religious traditions, whether you're talking about the Hebrew prophets, whether you're talking about the gospel narratives and the parables, over and over again, we see commitment to those who are on the underside, whether it's the underside of society, being the status quo, or the victims of exploitation. We see commitments to those, whether they are deserving or undeserving, whether they are prodigal sons, right, or those who view themselves as righteous by their own merit, where there's an inverted structure and an inverted moral paradigm. This is also in the American psyche. And the more that I think that we can play to that and speak to that, the more I think that we can find common ground to defy some of the rhetorical moves that have divided us due to the media echo chambers of Fox News and MSNBC and Crossfire and all of the other 24-hour infotainment news cycles that actually make their money off of dividing our discourse in these sorts of polarizing ways. And then to the second question, which was efficiency. I think that's where I think that there are a lot of people now who are trying to speak against, and we're trying to push back against this language of efficiency because of the ways that what do we mean when we say efficiency, right? And unfortunately, quite often, it's about profit margins, right? It's just a euphemism for profit margins, right? And there is a growing community of scholars, of intellectuals, of protesters, and politicians that are beginning to reject that category. And I think that in the same way as we understand how discourse is shaped, we have to find effective ways to tap into that discourse so that we can also have cultural resonance across cross-sections of society, so that we can create allies across racial, ethnic, and even political lines and regional lines.
Kerry.
Hello. Couple of questions. First, let's take Harvard. I've been a trustee of SMU for 30 years. Every year, Harvard raises its tuition, then every university in America raises tuition. Except this last year, Sewanee, where my daughter went to school, became the first university in America to lower tuition 10%. So I've been part of raising money for buildings and programs and so on. And universities have raised, I don't know what the total amount is, but it's a fantastic amount. But it's done nothing to lower tuition. So when you get back to Harvard, why don't you maybe consider lowering tuition a little bit, because then the rest of the universities will apply. Now, the second comment I want to make is that when I hire an engineer to do a building for me, I don't hire him, I don't pay him on the number of buildings he has built with weak cement. I pay him for the quality of his service. So we're not addressing the problem here until we can address how you pay people. My doctor, who retired recently, called him up and said, well, he has 2,000 patients. We got to distribute the 2,000 patients. So we paid the medical profession by how many patients they see instead of how much time they spend with the patient. Now back to the law. Very interested in helping the poor, but we're not helping the poor when we don't produce lawyers who can help the poor. So the law schools need to have a system where, say a half-assed lawyer, but because I know that's not in existence.
We already have enough of those.
But we need a lawyer who can help the poor. He doesn't have to be an expert on constitutional law. He doesn't have to be an expert on condemning property and all these, exotic things that we need. The law schools need to produce a lawyer for the poor, help them with their problems. We're not doing that. So I'd like some comment on that.
Well, I want to just one comment, which is I referenced this UNT Law School where I'm going for a luncheon meeting, and I haven't been involved in it at all. I have no affiliation connection with it, but I admire what they're trying to do because they're trying to do what you said. It's a lot of second career people. It's a lot of people who are in a very diverse number of communities, and that's where they select their students from. It's a very low tuition, at least compared to law schools, and they're trying to get people who are in their communities invested in it, who once they get the law degrees won't abandon their communities, if you want to look at it that way. So that's one effort to try to do it, and of course, they're not going to be ranked very high on the law school rankings, I'm certain. And I don't think test scores are the predominant admissions criteria for them, but they are addressing the mission, and for that I admire them a bunch. And they have a very talented group of people administering them, including their dean is former dean of the SMU Law School and has moved there to sort of do this mission.
Can I jump in here really quickly, Professor Walton, and broaden Carrie's question just a little bit, because I agree with you and I support the mission of UNT Law School, but I think it's the mission of every law school to instill or cultivate the value of service to the poor and to enable lawyers to do it. And can I ask all of you, Professor Walton is an educator, but the other three in their professions, about the role of professional education in cultivating, instilling, and enabling budding professionals, I suppose.
Well, I can say what I'm hoping for and what I'm optimistic, if not Pollyannish about, is that what we see at UNT Law School, what we see, I know it's happening. I have several students that are in medical school in the UC system at UCLA, UC San Francisco, and they're on scholarships, full rides, based upon demonstrated commitment to serve underserved populations, right? And so they'll pay for their education if they're willing to come out and serve. And these are all new initiatives within the last decade, right? So again, I'm hoping that there's a current that's pressing back against. In terms of the arms race for higher education tuition, right? That's just absolutely, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's nothing I can say to defend that. There's nothing I can say to let Harvard off the hook or any other institution off the hook on that. Now, one thing I can say, once again, I hope it's part of the trend that's pushing back against this. We saw it in Brown, we saw it with Yale, we see it with Harvard now. Harvard spends more, the number one expenditure for Harvard is building and upkeep. The number two expenditure is financial aid for students, right? We give more to financial aid than we do for any other thing except for building and upkeep. And this not alone, it's where you go for free. Now, there's still the problem, what are the odds of someone making less than $60,000 to $80,000 from a household that makes less than $60,000, $80,000 getting access to a place like Harvard because of the way privatized education and the like? That's something that we still have to speak to. But we're hoping to do that through this kind of broad admissions process. And that if we stop jacking up the price so high, maybe we won't have to give so much in higher education in terms of in financial aid, right?
Efficiency and economies of scale, right, are business science terms that would lead some to think that ultimately through, let's say, innovation. I mean, healthcare is probably the worst place to look for innovation driving down costs because it creates more efficiency. However, we all are beneficiaries of that technical innovation, both at the medication level or in the technical level. But one of the things I want to respond to this question is, I think our young people in medical school need visual examples, not verbal examples. I think that would be true in the law schools or the law profession, okay? I had a conversation yesterday with two students, senior students at Kansas University Medical School, who were doing a paper on a project that was struggling in Kansas City metropolitan area around Project Access, which is giving patients access to specialty care who are uninsured, modeled after some work we did here in Dallas. And one of the comments I made to these students was, I asked them, how were the faculty of your medical school supporting the project of providing specialty care access for the underserved beyond their just normal responsibilities? Was that built into their job? So it's easy to pick on the medical school, but it's not something, I'm not trying to do that. What I'm saying is, I think that when you think about employment, when a physician becomes an employee of a corporation, whether that's a for-profit, not-for-profit, or a publicly traded company, there's this tension that is created that I think that in the healthcare field, our students, my children, need to see across that entire continuum that we can make room for this work in addition to our other responsibilities. I think that the social justice passion comes deeply from within the individual, not from a corporation and not from politics. I think politics tries to manage it as a reflex, because of the marketplace's insensitivity to it. So the insensitivity of a marketplace is going to go this direction against justice, the structural things that happen in the marketplace. That's the business science. It's just on a trajectory that many of us can't control. That sense of hopelessness, and Jonathan Sachs in his book, The Dignity of Difference, really describes this precisely. If you want to pick up a really tight description of this, that the marketplace is moving on a trajectory that most of us would get anxious about. And it's our faith tradition. It's something about the human person and who we are as people, the way we're built, the way we're wired, what's put inside of us at creation, that brings us to this notion that there's something more. There's meaning out there. And that's really what I label social justice. Now that gets distorted inside a political discourse. And I think, and to your point, we should be more sensitive. I get the message. We should be more sensitive about words we use, but that's not really what I was using it as. I calling it out because that's the way we're put together. And I think out of that reflex, then we have to have visual examples, not verbal examples, not all the stuff from the pulpit, but rather visual work that we actually show up, or we accept somebody into our practice, or we don't kick them out. You either don't kick them out or you accept them in. But we actually are very intentional. And I think that's the counterculture movement that we can and should have as part of our life.
David, do you want to comment?
Yeah, my short answer would be that I think there are constantly conversations at our seminary about what should be in the curriculum. As I'm sure there are in all of our fields, there's a huge tension between sort of core information and knowledge and the sort of professional development segment of things. So we talk about it as, how much time we're going to spend in the 5th century and how much time we're going to spend in the 21st, and there's a constant tug of war. One clear result of which is that education can't end upon ordination. And that's why I think that experiences like this are so important, because I would say certainly for seminarians, you're not going to get a whole lot of argument about the value of serving the poor, right? There's sort of philosophical consensus. The question is, once you're 10 years out and you're buried in emails and memos and fundraising and resolving conflict and a difficult member on the da-da-da, are you remembering what that philosophical commitment is, and are you turning it into practice? So I would say, in some ways, the education that we get once we're out may be even more important than the education that we get when we're in.
Ladies and gentlemen, I have a fiduciary obligation to your time, and so I'll ask you for 4 brief favors. First, will you join me in thanking Professor Kinsey and our panel, Dr. Walton, Rabbi Stern, Mr. Ladriere, and Professor Walton. It was a panel of information and insight. Second, I'd like you to join me in thanking the Texas Scottish Rite Hospital for Children for their 3rd year of warm hospitality and hosting the conference. It's been a home for us. 3rd out of 4, almost done. Let me ask you to join me again in thanking Candy Crespo and her staff from the McGuire Center for Ethics and Public Responsibility. Finally, take your programs with you. On the inside, you will see contact information. We earnestly solicit your suggestions and recommendations for themes for future conferences. Many of the 29 conferences that we've had have come from participants' ideas, and we'd ask you to help us again. The planning committee will meet in 3 weeks to begin our planning for the 30th conference. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.